Welcome everyone, and thank you so much for watching. If you want to know how Carsten Jensen's We the Drowned weaves together a couple of hundred years of Denmark's history as a seafaring nation with an ambiguous narrating voice and comments on gender roles in a combination of humor and seriousness in the way that Carsten Jensen is known for, then please keep on watching. My name is Desiree Ohrbeck, and I am a former Danish lecturer at the Scandinavian Studies Department at University of Washington. Carsten Jensen is a writer, a literary critic, an essayist, and a political columnist. Since his debut in 1975, he has published 23 works of literature. His literary work has earned him several prizes, including the Gyldne Laurbær, the Olof Palme Prize, and the Søren Gyldendal Prize. We the Drowned has been translated to 20 languages, and 4 more languages will be added shortly, including Mandarin. The book has sold more than 65,000 copies in the United States. Welcome, Carsten.
Thank you, and thank you for your introduction.
Of course. Is there anything you would like to add to this introduction that you find I have not included?
I think you said it all. I have nothing to add.
Thank you. So if I were to briefly give an overview of your very big novel, We the Drowned, it would go something along these lines. We the Drowned is a novel that stretches over a period from 1948 till 1945, where the reader follows 4 generations of seamen, Laurits, Albert, Herman, and Knud Erik, and the women, mothers, and wives surrounding them. The story centers around the small town of Marstal, which is a little town in the Danish island called Ærø, as well as, and we also have the narration is also on the 7 Seas and in London and many other places in the world. If you only had 2 sentences to describe your book, how would they sound, Carsten?
It's a novel about man and the sea, about a small town and the big world, and about war and peace. And that's only 1 sentence. And as you can hear, I mean, it is big subjects, even though let's say it is a small town. It is the type of men and women of a very small town on a small island in a forgotten part of the Baltic.
Yeah, they are definitely.
I do feel in the same time that it is a universal story, because the sailor is a universal figure. And I've met, readers from all over the world who said, but you wrote about my town, because I think all seafaring, sailor cities, towns are more or less, seafaring towns are more or less the same.
Yeah, and it's also, I think, universal in the way that you describe the development within a human being, from child to an older person. And both in women and in men.
Yes, I mean, I had the big problem, since the novel spans 4 generations, 100 years. I couldn't come up with 1 single character who could tell you the whole story, because very few people live that long. So I had somehow to jump from 1 generation to the next. And the most central of the characters is the 2nd generation. And we follow him from Albert, as his name is, from he's a kid until he dies as an old man. Some of the others, we don't get to know their whole lives. We just see glimpses of their lives.
Yeah. Yes. And so when you were dealing with this story, in the beginning, I was like, am I reading this? Like, is there something I don't understand? Because I kept stumbling on the we in the story. And I was like, first I thought it was a person, or like, I didn't understand the literary way you were dealing with it. But then I was like, okay, sometimes I am like listening to gossip in this small town as a we. Other times the we is amongst the group of boys who are out for revenge on their incredibly, what's the word? Like Isaiah is such a
He's a
mean,
sadistic teacher,
he
an
is a
evil
sadistic
teacher,
yeah.
yes.
Yeah. And at other times I am at sea listening to the seamen and their struggle. And so how did you deal with this narrating voice? What was your, like, do you remember when you went through the different stages of like it as a literary tool? How did you go about this?
But you see, I had a big problem from the start, which was this spans 100 years. And who is the narrator? How do I create a narrative voice? Because I didn't want to jump from one character to the next. I wanted there to be a unifying voice. And actually, I had written half the novel, and I was not really happy with the voice, which I felt was a very kind of traditional, all-knowing, writer, storyteller, narrative voice, which wasn't satisfying. And so it was actually inspiration from an American novel, Jeffrey Eugenides, The Virgin Suicides, which has a narrator which is first person plural, a we. It's about 5 sisters from a family in a little suburb, all committing suicide. And it's told by the local boys who make a kind of museum of these girls. And I felt, a place like Marstal is a very strong, tight community. And when I was a kid, in Danish, you have this word saying like, you did this, you did that. But in Marstal, they always said, we did this, we did that. There was this strong sense of community, and I decided that I want to use the we, the kind of community as the storyteller. And in a way, the we functions as a Greek choir in the old Greek tragedies. It's always on the stage, always watching and commenting on what's going on. And then once in a while, one of the characters step forward on the stage and tell his own story in first person plural, like one of the characters, Albert, who as a young man goes to the Pacific, to the South Sea in search of his father, who's assumed dead, but he believes he's not. And so I started really working with that we, and I felt it gave the whole novel a totally distinct, different character. I found the voice in that we, and yes, it is an unusual narrative voice.
Well, that's very interesting.
I'm glad that you finally got used to it after your initial difficulties.
Well, I was starting to, I was wondering, is it me as a reader? Is there something I don't get? Like, who is this we? Was I introduced to him before? But then as I read along, it made sense. And I didn't plan on asking you this, but what you just said is so interesting in terms of both the boots that keep reoccurring in the book as a symbol, and also the stone that is set up in Mustad, right? Because they're both, boots can only be worn by one person, but they are given from generation to generation, they're passed down. And the stone, again, is also one individual person wanting that in the city or in the town, but it's for everyone. And it's you say very clearly in your book, it's to symbolize that togetherness.
Yes, yes. I wanted also, apart from the we that somehow connects all the voices and generations in the novel, I wanted to establish some kind of community symbols. And one of them is, as you say, the boots. The first character, Laurits, has these very big boots. And when he disappears, he goes to sea, as the men of the town do. They are all sailors, more or less. He leaves them behind. And for his son, that is a sign that he will somehow one day come back. And that keeps the hope that dad is alive somewhere on this big planet, somewhere in another part of the planet. And so when he goes finally, when he becomes a sailor, he starts wearing them and goes searching for his father, that he cannot give up the hope that he's alive somewhere. He finds his father, but it's a huge disillusion, a huge disappointment. Yeah. And so he doesn't hand over the boots to his father, but takes them back with him. And they become, for the next generation of boys in this case, they become a kind of, symbol. To wear these boots, just stand in them, is a symbol of becoming a man, of, manhood. And it is very much a novel about men, because the sea back then was a man's world. Mm-hmm. But you also mentioned gender roles, and they were in a seafaring town like Master quite unusual, because the men were absent most of the time. I mean, if you were a kid growing up with a dad who was a sailor, it meant you grew up with an absent dad. You were in some ways fatherless. Dad might come back during your childhood 5-6 times. The first couple of times you didn't know who he was. He was a stranger invading your house and sleeping with mom. And why was he in the bedroom? And when you got to know him, he left again and was back a couple of years later. So, it was often called a family saga, or a saga of kind of families, but it isn't. It's a story of broken families, because all the fathers are absent, and some of them die and never come back. So it's about, in a way, Master was a matriarchy. Not that the women had the power of town. Like there wasn't a female mayor, for example. They didn't own ships, but they ran the families single-handedly. They had very lonely lives, so their community was with other women. Mm. And so there's a description of when the first male character, Laurits, doesn't come back. After a couple of years, the neighbor women gather in the house of the woman who is now a widow, but there's no official statement, because nobody knows, where is he? He just hasn't been back, seen for 3 years. So they gather and tell her, now you are alone, you're a widow, and we are there for you. So there's this kind of very strong female community too in a town like that. And in the same time, there is this very masculine, very violent world of the sailors. And this was, when I created the we, I had to ask myself, but who is the we? What does the we cover? It's the men, because their worlds were so dramatically different that I couldn't include the two experiences, those of women and those of men, in the same narrative voice. So what takes the turn of the book is that in the second half of it, some of the women start rebelling against, not so much the men, as against the style of life that has been imposed on them, which is a very lonely life, where they have all the responsibility in the family and single-handedly have to bring up the kids, the boys. I mean, it goes better with the girls. So there is this, permanent tension between the sexes in the book, because their lives are so dramatically different.
And so that's interesting, because it kind of changes. In the beginning, the women are anxiously waiting for their husbands and sons and relatives to come back from sea, and they have like a supporting role. But then I think with Clara Fries, it changes, and you stress pretty clearly in the book that when she starts taking classes to educate herself, that is when she starts also being acting in a way where she's thinking about her self-interests, almost taking advantage of the older seamen, then she changes her own position and potentially her son's future. It turns out she doesn't really, but I also get a feeling when I'm reading this that it's not only about strong women, it's also about the world in which the women have to take what they want, but in a world that is dominated by men, and in doing so, it's as if they are forced to shed some of what we perceive as femininity, at least the way we define it, I guess. Does this make sense? Like, I don't know how you thought about this, but the strong females are kind of not feminine. And if you want to comment that, I also want to hear your thoughts on Miss Sophie, who is kind of a hybrid, or turns into a hybrid, at least. That's the way I read it. How do you see it?
Well, I think, there are like 4 generations of women in the book. And the first one is very early in the book, left as a widow. And she just has to be there for her kids. I won't say a supportive role because, she is strong. She has to be. They were forced to be strong because their lives were full of losses. When, they went down to the port to say goodbye to the men who went out and stayed away sometimes for years. This goodbye was also a rehearsal for death, for the eternal goodbye, because so many of the men never came back. And that's what gives the books its title, We the Drowned. This is a community where so many men disappear. If you went to the cemetery for these 100 years that the novel takes place, you would find that there were astonishingly few men buried because they never came back. Mm-hmm. In a way, the sea was a war zone. It was only that it was nature they were fighting. The unpredictability of foreign oceans. And so I think in a kind of, in a world like that, there isn't much room, for seductive women. And this kind of traditional female charm. It's about being tough, being able to carry heavy burdens, those of being alone with the kids, those of the loss of not only often yours, but sometimes sons that don't come back, a father, a brother, an uncle. It's all over the place. It is a kind of war zone. And so you have the second generation of men. Albert is unmarried, but he has a Chinese mistress who is a very, very clever businesswoman. And she leaves him. It turns out a gigantic fortune.
John Sumay.
Yes. And when he dies, he leaves his fortune to Clara, that you talk about, who is a widow too, but so much younger than him. And he can't somehow, she needs a man in her life after having lost her own and being alone with 2 kids. And she just sees that here's a chance. Yes, he's older than me, but I need, a center in my life, somebody to kind of build a life around. And he somehow isn't really ready for it. He's attracted to it, but he can't cope with it. And he ends up in something you can call, if not a suicide, it's close to a suicide. But he leaves all this money to her. And she starts educating herself. And what she wants to do with the money is to change master, not to invest it in ships and fleets, but to break the back of the sailing industry, to bring back the men into the families, to give the kids a proper family, a father who's not always away. And she is a kind of tragic heroine, because what happens is that the men still make a living as sailors, but they start sailing on ships that don't belong in the port because that's gone. And so they are even less at home than they used to. And then comes the Second World War, where the great majority of the sailors in the town were gone for 5 years, and a lot of them never came back. So she, she's a kind of early feminist, but her role is tragic because she is trying to do the right thing at the wrong time in history.
And she's incredibly lonely.
She's sorry?
She's incredibly lonely as well.
Yes, she's very, very lonely. And she tries to save her boy from the sea. She tries to stop him. And of course, that's a lost battle. Yeah. So but I felt the necessity of, moving the center of the story from the men's world to the women's world, and the second part or the last third of the novel.
Yeah. And what you're saying is, so there is a gender aspect, but there's also the world's influence. First of all, Clara is not from Marstal. She's from around, but she's not from that town. So she comes as an outsider and ends up changing the whole fabric of this town. And also, like you said, the Second World War influences what is happening, but the world in general, the outside world is changing. So, and you play off a lot of those, you put up two different things like.
Yes, but you see, I was very much faithful to the history of Marstal, but this is a novel and not a history book. So what happened with this little sailing town, it represents the Swan Song of the sailing ship era. And then along come the steamships, along come the motor ships, and somehow there wasn't capital enough in a small town like this to make these adjustments, to follow the new trends, to leave behind the sailing ship era. And that's where somehow the history of this town comes, if not to an end, then at least it stops being this very seafaring town where everybody are at sea, because you just can't cope with the technological and modern development because there's not enough money there. And that can be quite a boring story to tell in a novel. So I wanted to make a person kind of the responsible for this, and I chose a woman. I mean, this didn't happen. This is something I invented, of course. Yeah. But I felt that then there was much more, let's say, symbolic strength in making it a woman who rebels against the lifestyle of the men than just making it a question of technology and, capital to invest and so on.
So would you say that Miss Sophie and Clara Fries are like two different sides of the same coin?
No, I'd say that, yes, in a way, but while Clara is lonely and wants to rebel, Miss Sophie, who is a generation younger, incarnates the new woman, the woman who is an equal with the man, who does the same thing. She becomes a sailor. And she and the last of the men, the fourth generation, Knud Erik is his name, they meet under very dramatic circumstances. The last part of the book is Second World War, and the men of Marstal sail in these very dangerous convoys in the North Atlantic, where they brought, arms and whatever to Soviet Russia, and were under constant attacks of submarine boats and from the air, bomb attacks, and a lot of them were killed. And she is then on one of these convoy ships, and when we meet her again, we met her as young, when we meet her again, the ship has just taken a torpedo and it's sinking. And on another ship in this convoy, there is Knud Erik, who have become an alcoholic because of the intense pressure of sailing in the convoys and because of all the killing he's seen. And he sees from far away this sinking ship, and he sees what he believes to be a fat sailor jumping into the sea. And he, even though he knows it's almost suicide, jumps in after him, saves him. And when he has his arms around him, he realizes it's not a fat sailor, it's a pregnant woman giving birth in the water. And this turns out to be the love of his young years, which, I mean, it's a thing, you have to be quite daring to do a thing like that. I just throw away all realism and, in this scene. It's a very romantic scene. And I know a midwife who told me this could never happen. A birth would never take place under circumstances like this, the baby would not come out. It would probably sink. If this is what the world is like, sinking ships in ice cold water, I stay where I am.
Well, you just
But
said it's a novel. It's not reality.
a novel, I think there's a freedom. But when I have given readings and talks about it, I always know if there's a midwife present, because she will always protest and say this can't happen. But there was at an occasion another female reader who rose up and defended it. And she said, because when you read this part of the novel, it is so tough to read. There's so much death and dying. And then a newborn baby under these circumstances just represents hope.
Yeah.
And that, of course, was my intention.
Yeah, because like you say, there is a lot of death and destruction. And
but you can say about Miss Sophie, she's tough. Mm-hmm. And she does actually meet a wonderful man, an American, who wants to give her a wonderful life far away from the world. But she's seen things, and she somehow feels that he has an innocence that she cannot respect. She needs to go back to the war somehow. She's been topped in by it. She can't escape it. And that's, of course, why she ends up with another person who has been shaped by the war like herself, because they have a language in common that she doesn't have with this sweet, nice, normal man far from the war.
And she might end up saving him, because like you say, he's very distraught by all the death he has seen and participated in. He could have made a difference.
Caused too, yes. And there is this scene where they finally end up in each other's arms. And he can't somehow just surrender to her, because he's got all this death in his head. And he keeps talking about, I did this, I did that. And then she says, we did it. Mm-hmm. And there is this kind of common destiny that unites them, which means that finally he can just, finally he dares love again.
Maybe he can't get rid of it, but he can share the burden because of the we.
Say that, yes.
But what is it with the violence and sexuality in your book? There's a lot of men who have a sexual desire or a lack of, and in both situations, they seem to violently either perform sex on a woman, and that's deliberately, I say it like this, or violently hit the woman, or to push and pull sexually, but in a very violent way. What was your thinking when you dealt with there? I don't even remember if there is a sexual scene that is like feels like it's consensual.
There are not many explicit sexual scenes in the book. There is, it's clear that these men, generation after generation, are very much shaped by violence from childhood and on. Because I did, a lot of research here in Maastricht. I talked to a lot of people, old men with a long memory, and I went into the archives of the local Sailors Museum. And I realized that in the absence of fathers, very much the boys brought up themselves and each others in gangs, in violent gangs. And violence somehow was for them a method to bring up each other and teach each other about life. And they did fundamentally think of life as violent. That doesn't mean that their sexuality is necessarily violent. The scene you're thinking of is actually the old Albert, when he is seduced by this much younger woman. And somehow he feels his own powerlessness. He is ashamed of himself somehow. And he reacts with slapping her and immediately regrets it. Because there's another scene where you hear about his lovemaking with his Chinese mistress. And that's all the opposite of violent. But you hear about how his first encounters with sexuality was in the Brussels of Buenos Aires. And these Brussels were, kind of luxurious places, marble buildings with palm trees, and where he felt like he was a student, he was a pupil almost, being taught about love by experienced women, and he just surrendered. There was no violence in that experience. There was a kind of gratefulness, actually. But when we meet him with Clara, there's no grace, I'd say. No, he is just behaving very awkwardly, and he's ashamed of himself and his old man's desire somehow, which he thinks is inappropriate. Because, you know, what you noticed about the we, the narrative we, is also that in small towns, there's a lot of social control. There's a lot of, you know, prejudice, and people love to condemn each other. And this is another tension in the book between the town is in the same time like a tiny village with too much social control, and a metro, like a big cosmopolitan town, because everybody has, or the men at least, have seen the world. They've been everywhere. They've encountered, you know, other cultures. They know a lot about. They know also a lot about how their own culture is quite relative. There are other parts of the world where they do things in different ways. Yeah. So there is this tension. And I was very fascinated by that tension, because in some ways, I think we experience it today too in a globalized world, that in a way, a small seafaring town like that, 150 years, was a pioneer place of these tensions, these clashes between narrow-mindedness and a big outlook. That was one of the things that fascinated me writing the story.
Well, it's also, Madison is then a picture, or a symbol almost of Denmark, who has until recently been fairly homogeneous, and now is trying to deal with, understand the outside world that is now not just on the country's doorstep, but inside the country. And just like the seamen came back to Mazda, and the women and the society had to incorporate that, so does Denmark, I guess.
Yes, but you know, I did think quite a lot about that, because you are absolutely right. We used to be, and thanks to our small size, a very homogeneous nation. Also, we used to be a North European empire for many centuries. And like a Danish historian once said, thanks to our incompetent kings, we luckily lost most of our wars, which meant that every time we lost a war, we got rid of a troublesome ethnic minority. So, you know, and that meant that we ended up being very homogeneous. And in some ways, we are not coping very well with, you know, what we call foreigners, immigrants. We have a very hard time, and there's a lot of nasty right-wing populism in Denmark. And I did think about that when I started writing the book, because if, like a couple of generations ago, you asked the Dane, what kind of nation are we? They would all say we are a seafaring nation. Mm-hmm. And today, nobody would say that. They would say that, yes, we are kind of post-industrial welfare society. But if you said historically, what were we? We would say, oh, we were a peasant nation. And the outlook of the peasant is dramatically different from the outlook of the sailor. Because, you know, you can find sailors that are racist, of course you can, but they have been forced to live together, work together on the deck and in foreign ports with people who were dramatically different from themselves. And it did work. They could do it. But the peasant, the farmer, if he sees a stranger crossing his field, he immediately gets suspicious, you know. Who is he? What does he want here?
That is so interesting. Yeah, because the farmer looks down into his earth, and the sailor is out in the world. Yeah.
And you know, in some of the childhood descriptions in the first part of the book, you see how the boys from that little town, 2 kilometers, from the town, there are the peasant boys, and they are enemies because the peasants don't understand anything. They are different from us, and so on. There are these, and in this island, which is so small, I am actually on Ærø right now as we speak. I'm in Master, where we have a house. I don't live here, but we have a house here. But there's still such huge difference on this tiny, tiny island, politically and culturally, but I wanted also to remind the Danes that once we were a seafaring nation with a much bigger outlook than the outlook that populism offers.
Well, and it's very clear when one knows about your political standpoints, it's very clear to see in your description of people drowning in the water that already back when this book was written, this was on your mind in terms of, I think, at least that's my reading of it, this was on your mind in terms of what is going on in Europe these days. Am I right in saying
No,
this?
not actually, because you're thinking of the refugees drowning in the Mediterranean, I suppose.
Yes.
Yes, but that wasn't really an issue when I wrote the book. Okay. It had started, yes, but it hadn't really come up as a kind of subject of political debates. That was much later, because the book was published in Denmark in 2006, and it took me 5 years to write it. So no, that was all about, this town and how it shaped this town to have to learn to live with losses. And that's where the title comes from. It's not a political reference to anything contemporary.
It could have been written today, though.
Yes, but it wasn't on my mind when I wrote it. But sometimes I think that novels, time passes, and decades later you can read something else into it. Yeah. But the back then master in the 19th century and early 20th century in the rest of Denmark was called the town of the widows. Mm-hmm. So you can see it was really something that shaped the town. And I had a Norwegian scholar who told me, "You've written a book about grief." I'd never thought of that, but he told me that there was, he'd come across Norwegian readers who had lost someone, and who was reading it as a kind of, here's somebody else who knows about losses. Mm-hmm. And that had never occurred to me that it could be read like that.
Well,
but it could.
It just shows that it's still relevant in so many different aspects, I think. I want to skip some of the questions I had prepared.
I'm sorry, because I probably talk too much.
No, it's great. I love it. We just talk about whatever comes up, and works great, I think. But I want to ask you, I think I have my character in mind, but I want to ask you, in the book, which of the characters is your favorite and why?
Well, I think my favorite is also the one who is somehow the one given most attention. It's the second generation, Albert. We meet him in the 1850s as a kid, and we say goodbye to him just after First World War, where he dies. So we follow him on a lifelong quest, and he's, he goes through many stages in his life. There's first the search for his father and the disappointment when he meets him. There is this saying he has when he comes back to Master after many years of traveling, and he says, "Life didn't make me any wiser, it just made me tougher." And I think it might be true or not true, but I think it somehow sums up the tough sailor's life. And then in the end, he who is childless learns to be a grandfather. And the final character of the novel, Knud, he takes care of him when he loses his father and has this unhappy affair with Knud mother that he regrets. But there is something in the relationship between that little boy and the old man, which just it gave me a lot of good writing it and, you know, inventing it. And he's also the one who goes to the recent widows of the town. He's the one who goes there telling them your son has disappeared or at sea, or your husband or whatever. But the one who fascinated me the most is the evil guy called Herman.
Yeah.
Yes, who kills his stepfather and who rapes a woman and probably does a lot of other bad things we haven't heard about. And because there was a real challenge. I mean, I felt in order to write this, I had really to go deep into myself, because somehow I wanted to make a kind of credible portrait of a man who's a bad man, but in the end, surprisingly, on one of the convoy ships, becomes somehow a man who's able also to create a sense of community under very tough, stressful circumstances on a ship where you might be sunk any moment. And he all of a sudden shows a side of himself that you wouldn't have believed, that makes him acceptable to a community. So he was the one that I found most fascinating writing. He was definitely not a guy I liked, and I would never invite him in my home. But, you know, I later on thought a lot about this challenge as a writer of somehow trying to understand evil. Yeah. And I read about a very particular animal living in East Africa called the naked rat, which lives so deep down underground that there is no oxygen. And it's the mammal who can live for the longest time without oxygen, longer than the big whales. And somehow I felt it could be the totem animal of writers. We have to be like that naked rat and go deep underground in the human mind to the places where there's no oxygen and come back with our tales and tell what we saw down there. And that's in a way what I tried to do with Herman.
I think he's very fascinating as well. And I think what was also interesting was people forget, and a new generation looks at things differently. No one who knew him back in Marstal wanted him on the ship. But the younger generation almost had him, as well as the baby, as a mascot.
Yes, exactly. That's very precise. Yes, on the convoy ship, he becomes a kind of mascot. Yes. Yeah. And he has, of course, also, let's face it, been punished by life, because he has lost both his legs and one arm. And what he's got left is what he calls the essential member. He's got that hand left with which he masturbates, which he brags a lot about, and which the men, of course, can't help finding hilarious, that he has this kind of sense of humor under these hopeless circumstances.
You kind of had to amputate him, both because he was an emotionally amputated person, but also to create in the reader a sense of justice, I think.
Yes, but you know, there were readers who blamed me that I hadn't killed him off, who said, why didn't you kill him? He deserved to die.
Well, maybe he did, but I think it makes it so much more interesting that he's still around. To me, he's the most interesting character in the book as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But you know, it's sometimes you learn things about your book from other readers. And I was invited to a festival in Colombia, in Bogota. The book has been translated into Spanish and was published in Colombia too. And I got a lot of reviews in local newspapers, and they all compare it to Gabriel Garcia Marquez' 100 Years of Solitude.
That's a big compliment.
And called it magic realism. And I had never thought of it as magic realism. I had thought of it as, in between, I break with realism. The old Albert is haunted by prophetic dreams where he sees things that is going to happen. He sees ships from Marstal going down in the First World War. He knows who's going to die when he walks the street of Marstal, which really haunts him, of course.
But that's interesting how other cultures, like you traveled and then you got a perspective you wouldn't have thought
Yes.
of, how other
And-
cultures, just like with the seamen, influenced your way of
Yes.
thinking.
Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
And of course, I did realize the ending of the book. The ending of the book is, I guess I can give it away, is it ends on that very evening in 1945, the 4th of May, when the Germans capitulated in parts of Northern Europe. And Marcel, of course, is overcome with joy because our heroes, the ones we've been following in the last part of the book, arrive in Marcel on a stolen German boat exactly when this announcement comes from illegal radio stations. And so people start dancing in the streets. And then I resurrect all the characters in the book, all those who are long gone, long dead, because of course, most of them are, since it spans 100 years. And they all hold hands and start dancing through the streets. Mm-hmm. And with that, I somehow wanted to say how closely connected we always are with the dead, with the past, yeah. How we stand on the shoulders of the past, how there is a continuity that we might not be aware of. And of course, that continuity is very strong in a society like a seafaring town where they've been sailing for, 400 or 500 years, done nothing else. But that's what I wanted to do with the ending, to create this, let's say, a universal image of continuity in human life. Mm-hmm.
Well, you tie this neat bow and also let them enter the scene and say goodbye after this gigantic work.
Good to say goodbye to the reader.
Yeah, exactly. And
the so reader, the chance to say goodbye, yes. It's almost like on theater, when it's all over, all the actors come out on the stage and
and this has been turned into theater several times. How do you feel about this book living a life of its own now out of your hands?
Oh, I think that's wonderful. That's absolutely wonderful. The first time it happened was just a modest little theater in the province. And it was a one-man monologue. And it was done in an amazing way. And this was for young people. So it toured schools for several years. And the second time it was a theater group from a little group of islands in the Botnic Bay, Ålands Island, Ålandsøerne, which has a similar story to Master with seafaring. And there was a group there that made a play. And then there was this Belgian music theater, and they made a very radical feminist interpretation of the book. They cut off the first 2/3 and then focused on Clara, that we've been talking so much about. She was the hero. We followed her and her fight for independence, and there was a lot of music and singing, and it was absolutely wonderful. And also because they came to Master, and in one of the big docks here, where you build ships, was the theater. And there was sold out every evening. In this little place, 2,000 people came to see it. And they lived in town, the actors, and they became very popular. So they couldn't walk down the streets without people inviting them for a drink.
That's a very welcoming seafaring town.
It is, yes, it is. No, it was so great for me to see it, and also to see this huge audience coming to watch it.
That's fantastic. So your final sentence in the book is, "We danced with the drowned and they were us." And I think I've been thinking so much about that sentence. Like, who are we and who are the drowned, and how are you thinking about that final sentence?
Well, I wanted to sum up the book with it simply, because this is about the continuity, that the dead never really go away. They are always there with us somehow, and they have shaped us, whether we know it or not. And so in that final scene, I make the dead come back and dance with the living. And yes, the drowned, this is all the sailors from the town who drowned, but they lived before they drowned, and with their lives, they shaped the town and its experience and its outlook at life. And you know, in a way, what I learned was, of course, that all those who perished at sea, they never came back. They don't have a tomb. There was nowhere the family could go and, you know, sit there, the widow with her kids, and here is dad. So in a way, I felt that with the novel, I'm bringing back the dead. I am somehow giving them, in language, that burial they never had in the soil, in the ground.
Yeah.
So, but you know, I had a very close relationship with the town while writing it. I rented a house here back then. We didn't have a house, but I rented one. I went to the local Sailors Museum, which is an absolutely unique place made by the locals, not by professional or academics, and told them about my project. And they gave me the key to their archives. And then I allied myself with a local public library. And we have very good public libraries in Denmark, as you know. And so I gave many evenings. There was public meetings where I told them about my work in progress. I read from it, even though it wasn't finished. And then I said, you know, what we are doing now here is that we are somehow doing business with each other. You get a book about your town and I want your stories.
Yeah.
So they invited me, you know, to come home to coffee and homemade cookies. And then I got so many stories or diaries or memoirs that nobody but the family had ever read. And that really influenced the book.
Yeah.
And people would stop me in the street and say, you know, I've got this grandfather, he gotta be in your book. And then I said, well, you have to understand the thing. It's your story, but it's my book. And
Yeah.
I am the captain of this ship. So, and this is a metaphor that in a seafaring town you understand and respect. Mm-hmm. So not everybody were there. And of course it is a novel. So I changed. There was a lot of inspiration, but I changed a lot too. Mm-hmm. There's no kind of exact copy of anybody in this town, but there are similarities that stroke people. You know, people would say to me, God, this story, I heard it when I was a kid. And I say, you couldn't have, because I invented it. Yeah. And so I think I really spoiled it for future local historians, because people don't anymore know what was fiction and what was real.
But that's wonderful, because in that way, they got to say goodbye to their drowned ones. And we as readers, if we sometimes feel drowned and maybe go through life not knowing exactly what to do, it might not make us wiser, as you said, it might make us tougher, but it all comes full circle, I think.
Yes, in a way, that's what I wanted it to do, yeah. You know. I did really feel that people in Marstal felt it was their book. It wasn't just mine. It was our book together. We somehow created it together, and I feel we did that. I could not have done it without their participation, you know, and without their openness. And
so that's another we that makes sense.
To contribute. Mm-hmm. And there was, you know, there was an old man who happened to be the father of the best friend of my childhood, and he was in his 80s, and he claimed he had recognized one of the characters, but that's me, he said. And stupidly, I told him it wasn't him, which I shouldn't have done. Come on, why couldn't I just grant him that little triumph? But then he said something very wise. He said, it doesn't really matter, because one way or the other, we are all there. Yeah. And I couldn't have said that in any better way myself. That was my ambition. Yeah. And, you know, I think that a member of my family, my cousin, who was some years older than me and has a very motherly relationship to me, or had, she's dead now. She once asked me, she said, I see how hard you're working on that book, but do you really believe it'll interest anybody outside of this island? And that was a tough question because I said, I don't know. I just hope. But I think sometimes universal stories, rise out on a focus on the narrow, I never thought this is a story about all sailors. This is a story about all islands. No, I just thought this is a story about this town, this people. But somehow a lot of people found themselves in it.
It ended up becoming universal.
Well, that's what I hope. But I mean,
Yeah.
yes. I mean, by the end of next year, it'll be being translated into 24 languages. Yes. Among them, you mentioned Mandarin and Persian and Bengali. So it has really it is still traveling in a way.
Yeah. Well, I'm very, very happy for your success. And I think this might be a good place to end the interview, unless you have something you feel we didn't cover or that you would like to add.
No, I think we got it.
We got it covered. Okay.
Yes. And thank you for very, very good questions and for all your engagement in my novel. That's great.
Well, you're very welcome. I enjoyed reading it. I love this kind of work. So thank you so much for letting me interview you. I really appreciate it. And then I want to say, of course, to our viewers, I want to say thank you. And I hope you found this discussion interesting and meaningful. The interview is part of an effort to promote Danish literature and English translation. In this series, I invite writers and literary experts to participate in interviews and discussions. If you're interested in reading and discussing Danish literature, I invite you to become a part of our virtual nationwide Danish book club hosted by Nita Schmidt. Before we end, I would like to take a moment to thank the Scandesign Foundation, Museum of Danish America, Northwest Danish Association, National Foundation for Danish America, National Nordic Museum, American-Scandinavian Foundation, University of Wisconsin-Madison, and University of Washington Scandinavian Studies Department. Thank you for tuning in and see you next time. And thank you again so very much, Carsten.
Thank you.